Hello to all my dear followers. First of all, thanks for all the support in the first season of this great fanfic, and second, be welcome to the second season of What if Naruto Awakened the magnet release and fell in love with Fem Sasuke? As always, if you want more seasons, in this case a third season, don't forget to give your like, comment and subscribe for more. So, we gonna start.
Chapter 11. Aftermath, the future awaits. A cacophony of faint whistles filled the air. The sound of metal moving at a rapid pace. Naruto panted heavily, his lungs burned. Sweat trickled down his face. His arms shook from the strain of holding them up. Around him was a veritable cloud of weapons. Flashes of black and silver whipped around him as the arsenal moved at his command. He could feel exhaustion setting in from trying to control so many things at once. It was the most he'd ever tried to do with his bloodline. Anyone who saw him right then would assume his mind was totally focused on the exercise. They'd be sorely mistaken. His mind was only half on the task. The other was focused on the same thing that it had been for the past month. Ever since SASUKE had woken from her coma, at first he was overjoyed that she'd finally woken up. For the week she had been unconscious, he'd barely eaten or slept. Everyone was worried about him. Him though? He'd only been thinking about her. To have her awake seemed like a blessing. After that had worn off, Naruto noticed a marked change in her. For the first few days she didn't really say much. She just sat in her bed and stared out the window. When it came time for her meals, he was concerned to notice that she barely touched her food. Slightly hypocritical, yes, but he was worried all the same. All he could do though was stay by her side and try to get her to talk. After about a week she started to talk more frequently, and he began to hope that maybe she would recover. 2 weeks after the Uchiha massacre, as it came to be called, he managed to convince her to go to her parents' funeral. It was a much smaller ceremony than the large memorial service that had been held for the clan, and she had stood with tears running down her face the entire time. A month after the incident, she was almost back to normal. But there were some key differences that, if he was quite honest, concerned him. After the event, she had become much colder, and her kindness showed itself less and less. With him she was still relatively normal, albeit not as nice and a bit grumpy. At least the few times he'd actually managed to get her to hang out at school. After school she'd just disappear. It was like she was avoiding him, though that was better than how she was with others. With them she'd become much brusquer, and she lost her patience with people easily. Once she'd completely obliterated Kiba in their spar and continued to ruthlessly beat him even after the match was called. More concerning was the growing darkness he saw in her. SASUKE hated her brother, and he was pretty sure that she wanted revenge. He began to feel as if he was losing her to their clan's curse of hatred. All in all, he was left feeling helpless, and that frustrated him beyond belief. In response, he'd thrown himself into his training. He resolved that he would never let something like this happen to his friend ever again. Most days, he spent every second that he wasn't at the academy or with SASUKE in the cave training relentlessly. He felt like that was the only thing to do. He'd pushed himself to the brink and beyond for the past few weeks. That was the only thing he could think to do. This whole ordeal had awoken a fierce protectiveness inside him. He felt a need to make sure it never happened again. A compulsion filled every fiber of his being. He always wanted to be strong, but now weakness wasn't an option. He had to be strong, to fulfill the promise he'd made to himself in that hospital room. I don't ever want to see that look from anyone I love ever again. With a fierce cry, Naruto forced the weapons around him to move even faster. Whoosh, whoosh, whoosh. The force of their movement filled the air with the sound of several humongous fans. He couldn't keep up that pace for long. His chakra coils were starting to burn from overworking them. A grunt of exertion left Naruto as he let go of his control. The cloud of blades careened towards the ground. Clang, cling, ching. For a few seconds the cave was filled with the deafening ring of metal on metal. It echoed off the walls and bounced back. There was one last tink as the last kunai dropped to the ground. An almost eerie silence followed in the wake of the noise. In the back of his mind, he felt that now familiar pull. He'd gotten used to it by now. It was more an annoyance than anything, though eventually he'd have to figure out what it was. The tap of wood on dirt reminded him of his grandfather's presence. Honestly, he'd been so caught up in his training he forgot it was being overseen. Naruto turned to see him carefully winding through the field of weapons towards him. There was slight frown on his face. "Come, I think it's time we talked," he said bluntly. Naruto barely withheld a wince. His jaw clenched tightly, and he found it hard to meet his grandfather's eyes. He knew this was coming. Ever since Sasuke woke up, he'd withdrawn from opening up to his grandfather. Sooner or later, the man was bound to intervene to make him do it. He just hoped for some more time to figure things out. Still, trying to avoid it would do him no good now. He allowed Madara to guide him out of the training cave and through the lift. Neither of them spoke. Soon enough, he found himself sitting in a chair across from his grandfather on the back porch. A small table stood between them with a teapot and cups on it. Steam poured from the spout into the slightly crisp winter air. Thankfully, it was slightly warmer than usual. Around them, the trees swayed in the wind. Their dull creak was the loudest thing. The atmosphere would have been really peaceful if he weren't about to have a serious discussion. It was his grandfather who broke the silence. "You're worried about your friend," he said. It was a statement, not a question. "Yeah," he mumbled. His grandfather merely quirked an eyebrow, as if to say, "Go on." Naruto hesitated. It was hard to open up after so long. "Oh, to heck with it," he thought. "Everything has been so different since she woke up. I get not wanting to talk about what happened, but she's completely avoiding me," he said. That was like the opening of the floodgates. Before he knew it, all his concerns started to pour out. All the things he'd bottled up for the past month. How his best friend seemed to have totally changed overnight. The fact she wouldn't talk to him at all. His anger at himself for not being able to do anything to help. His fear about her when she'd beaten Kiba to a bloody mess, and even continued well after he was unconscious. Once he started, he couldn't stop. His grandfather just sat there and let him vent. Occasionally, he'd pour another cup of tea when they got low. When all was said and done, Naruto felt like a huge weight had been lifted from his shoulders. It left him physically and emotionally exhausted. In the end, it came down to one question. "What do I do?" he said quietly. His grandfather frowned thoughtfully. The now empty teapot sat off to the side. "That's a tough question. By the sounds of it, Sasuke is feeling a lot of anger and sadness. Both are understandable. It wouldn't surprise me if she is worried about others betraying her like her brother did. It might be a while before she's ready to trust again," Madara said. He frowned. "Then how am I supposed to help her?" he asked. His grandfather took a few moments to consider the question. "In the short term, be there for her. Right now she feels completely alone. You need to remind her that she's not, that there are people she can count on and trust. Just don't force her to act happy. Let her get there on her own. More importantly, let her know you're there if she needs to vent. In short, be her friend," he said. Naruto nodded his head slowly. That made sense. He hadn't considered how alone she felt. To have a family and then have them ripped away from you. That must be terrible. Now that he had family in his grandfather, he couldn't imagine not having him. "Right now she feels just like I felt before I had grandpa. But worse," he thought. He mulled over what his grandfather said. Let her know she's not alone, that she can count on him. Trust him. Trust. That's it, he shouted excitedly. The beginnings of an idea started to form. For the first time in a while, he started to smile. Yes, he needed to show her she could trust him. The best way to do that was to show her he trusted her. He knew exactly what he had to do. "You seem to have had a realization. Seeing as I'm not a mind reader, would you care to share?" his grandfather said dryly. Heat flooded his cheeks. Naruto rubbed the back of his head sheepishly. He still had a massive smile as he spoke. "Sorry, I just realized what I need to do. I gotta show Sasuke she can trust me. To do that, I have to show I trust her. Right?" he explained. A small smile spread across his grandfather's lips. He seemed amused by Naruto's eagerness. "Oh, and how do you plan to do that?" he asked. Naruto froze slightly. He felt a nervous tingle. His stomach started doing somersaults. That's right. If he was going to do this, he needed his grandfather to agree. He wasn't so sure he would. "Well, I was kind of thinking I'd reveal something about myself. I was thinking of introducing her to you and telling her about my parents. If that's okay, he said. The frown he got caused him to hurriedly add, not everything, though, just who they are. Would that be good? He asked desperately. His grandfather was still frowning, but he at least seemed to be considering the idea. Finally, he said, I suppose so, though just know this is a massive risk to take. I won't stop you, though. I know how much your friend means to you. Let's just hope this risk is worth it. Nothing could remove the happy smile from Naruto's face. It will, trust me, you know? He said confidently. It had to work. He couldn't possibly bear to think what would happen if it didn't. Things didn't seem so bleak now that he had a plan. He just had to wait for the right opportunity. Right now, Sasuke wasn't ready for such a big shock. He was pulled from his musing by his grandfather clearing his throat. Now that we've discussed how to help your friend, there's something I need from you, he said. Naruto rose an eyebrow. What could his grandfather need? If he'd been paying closer attention, he might have caught the mischievous glint in his grandfather's eyes. Sure, what is it? Naruto asked. The slightly creepy grin he got set him on edge. Before he could comment, a small puff of smoke appeared in his grandfather's hand. It cleared away to reveal something he'd seen the nurses at the hospital use. A needle and syringe. Give me your blood, Madara demanded. Wait. His opportunity to introduce Sasuke to his grandfather didn't come for nearly 2 months. Just as his grandfather suggested, he'd tried to just be there for his friend. It had taken a while. The first few times he tried to spend time with her outside school, she tried to drive him off by treating him like she did Kiba now. He didn't let it get to him. Eventually she seemed to give up on that and grudgingly accepted his company. Not that she still wasn't slightly prickly. Tsh, why the heck are we out here, dummy? It better be worth it. I'm freezing, Sasuke said. She was bundled up in a warm crimson wool coat, with a black scarf around her neck, and her cheeks flushed pink. Her hands were tucked into her armpits for warmth. There's someone I want you to meet, he replied, hiding a smile beneath his own gray scarf. He led her through a familiar forest path. Though it didn't look so familiar right now, the landscape around them was blanketed in a thick layer of fluffy white snow. Even the pathway was covered in at least a foot of snow, making it difficult to tell where the undergrowth ended and the path began. Thankfully, he had been here enough time to stay on track. Gray clouds hung above them, silently letting loose yet more snow in great big flakes. The cold was made worse by a biting wind. Naruto himself was bundled up in black and orange coat and loose-fitting pants tucked into a pair of sturdy boots. Luckily, he had the ability to keep himself warm with fire chakra. Not that Sasuke knew that. She'd kill him if she knew he was holding out such a useful trick. Who the hell could there possibly be to meet out here? She asked with a growl. Despite the vitriol she constantly spewed, Naruto had taken this new Sasuke in stride. He knew she didn't mean it. Mostly. After a while, it actually became kind of funny. Well, clearly someone I want you to meet, he answered cheekily and had to quickly duck out of the way of the retaliatory swipe Sasuke took. Oi, not nice. Sasuke looked at him with narrowed obsidian eyes. There was a lot more life in them than several months ago, though it was tinged with the now familiar anger. I swear to God, if you're wasting my time for some stupid prank, she ranted. Beat me up and make me regret it, I know. He finished with a roll of his eyes. Besides, we're here, he said with an exaggerated sweep of his arm. Indeed, just as they'd rounded the last bend in the path, his grandfather's house had come into view. It stood out starkly against the white background. The overhanging roof on the second story was covered in a layer of snow, with icicles hanging from the eaves. A warm light shone through the windows, a beacon in the slightly dim light made by the overcast. Snowbanks were piled against the porch that wrapped around the house. And you thought I was pranking you, he told her with a smug smirk. Sasuke's cheeks got a little pinker. TCH, whatever. Let's get on with this, she replied. With his smirk firmly in place, Naruto led Sasuke up to the front step and onto the front porch. He paused a moment to knock off the worst of the muck on his boots before opening the front door to the entryway paved with stones. A wave of warm air hit him. The hallway was lit with a mild electric light that bounced off the wooden walls of the house. While Sasuke hovered in the doorway uncertainly, Naruto stepped inside and kicked off his boots. He stowed them in the cubby meant for shoes, and then took off his black and orange wool coat and hung it on a rack above the cubbies. Afterwards, now in just a t-shirt and loose pants, he turned to Sasuke with a smile. "Well, don't just stand there. Come in," he said. She hesitated a moment longer, chewing her lip uncertainly. Finally, she followed his lead. The door swung shut behind her, cutting off the cold winter air. "Whose house is this?" she asked as she kicked off her boots and hung up her coat. Underneath, she wore a long-sleeved version of her usual high-collar shirt. "The answer is my house, young lady." Naruto took perhaps a bit too much amusement in seeing Sasuke jump and let out a shockingly girly eep, as his grandfather seemed to materialize out of thin air. It was actually kind of funny when it happened to someone else. "Sorry, he has a habit of doing that. We should really put a bell on him," he said. Sasuke didn't say anything. She still seemed slightly unnerved by his grandfather's entrance. "Did someone say they want to practice chakra control for the next week?" Madara asked, a slightly annoyed look on his face. Naruto froze at the subtle threat. Oi, no need to get nasty. It was just a joke," he said nervously. The byplay seemed to shock Sasuke out of her nervousness. Finally having enough of being ignored, she asked, "Hey, just who the heck are you, old man? How do you know Naruto?" Madara rose an eyebrow at the fairly rude demand. It caused Sasuke to take an unconscious step back at his serious expression, though she didn't back off completely. Naruto was actually impressed. His grandfather was pretty intimidating when you first met him. "Guess that new arrogance is good for something," he mused. After a few moments of his stern gaze, his grandfather finally relented. "I suppose it is rude not to introduce myself. My name is Madara. I'm Naruto's grandfather," he said. Sasuke's eyebrows shot up and her head whipped around so fast he thought she might get whiplash. Her eyes were narrowed with a look of accusation. "Grandfather, I thought you said you were an orphan?" she said suspiciously. "Well, I am," he said with a shrug. Though seeing her look of annoyance, he elaborated. "My parents are dead, and I didn't meet Grandpa here until about a year and a half ago," he explained. "I'm sure we can satisfy your curiosity later. For now, why don't you come to the living room and warm up? I've prepared some tea," his grandfather said. Though she still looked suspicious, Sasuke gave a slight nod. Naruto had to withhold a sigh. That suspicion and cautiousness was fairly common when she encountered anyone new recently. Not that he could blame her. He felt a now familiar resentment towards Itachi bubble up. "If I ever get a hold of him, I'm gonna make him pay," he vowed. He quickly had to follow behind his grandfather and Sasuke, lest he be left behind. His grandfather led them to the sitting room. A fire crackled merrily inside a metal fireplace along the far wall. It had a stovepipe that traveled upwards to the ceiling, and it rested on a slab of stone. The fireplace was a new addition his grandfather had made since they were having several unusually intense snowstorms this year. In the center was a low table, a steaming pot of tea and 3 cups already set out. While Naruto and his grandfather readily sat on 2 of the cushions around the low-lying table, Sasuke hesitated. "No need to be shy, young lady. Come and have a seat," his grandfather said kindly. Sasuke stepped into the room hesitantly, almost like a scared animal tiptoeing through the forest cautiously. It wasn't exactly an unfair comparison. She made her way over to the table and took a seat adjacent to Naruto's. As soon as she was seated, Madara began to pour out tea for them. For a few moments they sat silently. It was broken by Sasuke, her need for answers apparently getting the better of her. "So if you're his grandfather, how come I haven't met you before?" she asked Madara. "Well, that's a bit complicated," he said. "The short answer is it's to protect the secret of Naruto's identity." His grandfather's answer made Sasuke look at him with a scrutinizing gaze. Naruto shifted uncomfortably under her stare. "Why would you need to do that?" Even though this was his idea, Naruto hesitated to answer. He found himself tongue-tied. It was all well and good to talk about revealing his secrets in theory, but in practice it was much harder. Especially due to the fact he was going to have to lie to her about certain parts of the truth. That was a necessary evil, though. He believed that wholeheartedly after learning about his grandfather's theory about the night he was born. How there was a group out there hunting the tailed beasts. It was a shocking thing to learn and had come out during one of their discussions in how to approach SASUKE. If what his grandfather suspected was true, letting SASUKE completely in could put her in more danger. He knew how she was. If she decided to stick to being his friend after this and she knew the truth, she'd insist on being part of it. He didn't want to put her in that kind of danger. No, it was for the best she didn't know the full truth. I guess this is sort of how Gramps felt when it came to keeping secrets from me. It gave him a new sympathy for what it must have been like for the Hokage. Thankfully, his grandfather took the question for him. Naruto's parents were both very powerful ninja, especially his father, my son. They have many enemies, due to the fragile state of the village following the Ninetales attack, and now as well. Madara paused as SASUKE flinched violently at the reminder of what happened to the Uchiha. It's important that it doesn't get out. Less scrupulous people might use it as an opportunity to attack the leaf while we're weakened. Hence why the third Hokage gave Naruto his mother's last name. He explained. Naruto was slightly worried about SASUKE as her eyes fell to the ground. He could see the glint of a tear sliding down her pale cheek. Hey, are you LRI? He started to ask, but she quickly cut him off. I'm fine, she said gruffly. He pretended to ignore it as she subtly wiped her eyes while taking a sip of tea. Once she composed herself, SASUKE looked up and pinned him with a scrutinizing gaze. So who exactly was your dad? He must have been a big shot if he really had that many enemies, she said. He licked his lips. His mouth was surprisingly dry, possibly from nervousness. Finally, he answered. His name was Minato Namikaze, the fourth Hokage, he said. Her response managed to wipe out all his nerves. It was a rare sight to see SASUKE gaping like a fish, even before the change in her personality. He couldn't help the laugh that bubbled up. Once she managed to pull herself together, she shot him a dirty look. That just made him laugh harder, which caused her to blush slightly. "TCH, idiot," she muttered. Naruto's laughter died down eventually, his stomach slightly sore from his mirth. He was left with a happy smile on his face. It had been a while since he was this happy hanging out with SASUKE. Maybe it was just wishful thinking, but he could have sworn there was a glint of amusement in her eyes too. That's why her next question caught him off guard. "Why are you telling me this all of a sudden?" she asked abruptly. There was a subtle quiver in her voice, an undercurrent of vulnerability he wasn't used to hearing. He hesitated in answering and took a few moments to form his response correctly. "The truth is, I've been really worried about you after it happened," he said. "I don't know how you feel, but I do know how much you loved your family, especially your mother. You're the first friend I've ever had, SASUKE. I don't really open up to others much. I guess you could say this is me trying to share more with you so you know you're not alone. I'll always be there for you, whether to talk or just listen." Part of him wanted to look away, unable to handle it if she negatively responded. A nervous flutter filled his stomach. There was no going back after this. As nervous as he was, the silence seemed to stretch for an eternity. SASUKE wasn't looking directly at him, her gaze fixed on the fire. Finally, she spoke. Her voice was so quiet it was almost impossible to hear. "Thank you." She opened her mouth as if to say more, but then her eyes darted in his grandfather's direction and then back. Perhaps she didn't want to say whatever it is in front of him. Sharp as ever, his grandfather picked up on her unease. "Why don't I go and get lunch ready?" Madara asked. He didn't wait for either of them to reply, and instead stood up and began to leave the room. He paused at the doorway to say, "It shouldn't be too long. I already have some dishes keeping warm in the oven." An awkward silence was left in his wake. It lasted several seconds, before SASUKE finally managed to look at him hesitantly. "Thanks for being my friend. I know I'm not pleasant to be around these days. It's just, every time I close my eyes, I see him killing them again, especially Mom. It makes me so angry," she said. Her voice shook from barely restrained emotions. I just can't get it out of my head. That seemed to be her limit. She burst into tears and seemed to curl inwards on herself. Great heaving sobs escaped her. At first he wasn't quite sure what to do with himself. Hesitantly, as though approaching a wounded animal, he leaned over and pulled her into a hug. He could feel as her body shook from the force of her crying. Occasionally she'd gasp for air. Naruto wasn't quite sure how long they sat there. He decided to just let her vent the emotions she seemed to have been bottling up. After what seemed an eternity, Sasuke finally stilled. The sobs died down, and he could even feel the tears stop falling on his shoulder. By now a mess of dampness from her tears, and less pleasantly, her snot. Not that he cared particularly much. Sure, it was gross, but he was more concerned with his friend. Eventually, she extracted herself from the hug awkwardly and took her seat again. He pretended to be oblivious while she cleaned herself up. I miss her so much, Sasuke whispered. He didn't need her to elaborate on who she meant. Me too. Unlike a lot of the adults, she was always nice to me. He replied. That earned him an odd look from his friend. It took him a few seconds to realize why. Oh crap. He didn't mean to tell her about the Ninetales. His brain ran in overtime trying to come up with an excuse. Thankfully his grandfather came to his rescue again. Probably because she was friends with your mother, Kushina, he said. They turned to see him in the doorway, a large tray in his arms filled to the brim with plates of food. It took a few seconds for his words to sink in. Wait, our mothers knew each other? Sasuke asked. She looked just as surprised as he felt. Madara nodded. Yes, from what I've heard, she was one of the few to know Kushina was pregnant. I suspect if Naruto's parents wouldn't have died, you two would have grown up together. Probably didn't take her much to connect the dots. Of course, since the third Hokage made it clear Naruto's heritage was to be the utmost secret, she wouldn't have said anything. He explained. Naruto had a lot of things click into place in his mind. Things he'd noticed but never understood. Like the way Mikoto seemed to act when she saw him. Those looks she'd give him were because she was remembering his mother. A stab of fresh pain went through his heart. He'd been saddened about her dying already, but now he felt it all the more keenly. It was like something was taken from him he didn't even know he had. Now let's dig in. This food won't eat itself. We can talk more after eating, his grandfather said as he sat the tray down on the table, careful to avoid knocking over the teapot. As usual, the food his grandfather made was good. While they ate, they talked about how the academy was going. Sasuke seemed particularly eager to talk to his grandfather about training when she learned Naruto got most of his training from him. That inevitably led to Madara inviting her to train with them sometime. After a few hours, Sasuke had to leave. Apparently she needed to finish a couple of the assignments Irika-sensei had given them. Naruto escorted her back to the apartment the Hokage had given her after the massacre. She paused at the door to say goodbye. Well, this is it. I'll see you in class on Monday, he said. Ugh. Don't remind me. It's annoying dealing with everyone there. None of those idiots takes training seriously. If I have to listen to any of those other girls complain about dieting again, I just might snap. Sasuke replied, her voice dripping with disdain for their classmates. Naruto rubbed the back of his head sheepishly, not really sure how to respond. I guess. Well, see you around. Sasuke nodded, the smirk on her face the closest thing he'd seen to a smile from her in months. Her ponytail disappeared behind the door as it clicked shut, leaving him alone in the darkening walkway. Better get going, he muttered to himself. The sky got progressively darker as he trudged back home. Around him, the snow started to fall faster. His mind began to wander as he walked. Today had gone a lot better than expected. He'd actually seen a glimpse of the Sasuke he was used to, though that also brought a frown to his face. It had also shown him that, for now at least, this more arrogant and dismissive Sasuke wasn't going anywhere anytime soon. That's fine. She's still my friend, no matter what, he thought. The events of a few hours prior were still fresh on his mind. Sasuke crying into his shoulder. It reignited that flame inside him, his vow to protect her no matter what. His jaw clenched at the thought. I have to get stronger. His grandfather was waiting for him when he got home. He sat at the table in the sitting room, staring into the fire. Naruto felt sort of detached as he walked across the tatami, just stood there. He was silent for a few moments. Crack, pop. The sound of the wood crackling in the flames seemed deafening in the silent room, only made louder by the way the snow seemed to have muffled all the noise outside. I need to get stronger. A lot stronger. I want to up my training, he finally said. It wasn't a question, but a demand. Oddly enough, it was almost like his grandfather had been waiting for him to say that. I'm not surprised. You'll get your wish tomorrow. Why don't you go wash up? I'll be making dinner shortly. After that, I want you to go to bed early. We'll be starting at 8 o'clock. Madara said. He nodded, though he felt a spike of curiosity went through him as he turned to leave. What will we be doing? He asked. His grandfather chuckled. The deep timbre of his mirth carried through the room. It's time you finally learned to use your magnet style properly, he said mysteriously. Naruto felt the corner of his mouth twitch, thoroughly bemused. In that moment, he decided to take a page out of Sasuke's book. TCH, melodramatic old man. As he walked away, he just barely caught his grandfather whisper something to himself. It left him with more questions. It looks like it's finally time, Kazahana. The next morning dawned bright and clear. An azure sky stretched far beyond the tree line. Above, the early morning sun shone high into the sky, causing the white landscape to gleam with a blinding light. Beep, beep, beep. Naruto groaned at the blaring of his alarm clock. Without really thinking about it, he reached over and pushed the button to get it to stop. His eyes blinked open groggily, only for him to instantly squeeze them shut at the brightness that peeked through the curtains. He took his time blinking the red spots out of them. That's when the memories of the previous night hit him. His head whipped towards his alarm clock, which read 7 o'clock. Naruto let out a relieved sigh. Good, he had plenty of time. Better get to it, he muttered. He threw the covers off and jumped out of bed. It didn't take very long to get showered and dressed. Soon enough, he found himself at the breakfast table. Unlike when they ate in the sitting room, the table in the dining room was higher and they had actual chairs to sit in. Madara wasn't a fan of sitting on the ground so early in the morning. Oddly enough, there was already a steaming plate of rice and fish waiting for him, a bowl of miso soup right next to them. Next to it was a note in his grandfather's handwriting. Naruto, I've gone ahead to make the preparations for our training. Meet me in the training area when you're done eating. Grandpa. P.S. Don't forget to put the dishes in the sink. Naruto felt his eyebrow twitch at the last line. You forget one time and all of a sudden he's constantly reminding you. He grumbled. He shoved his slight annoyance to the back of his mind, though, and quickly got to scarfing down his meal. When he was done, he was halfway tempted to leave the dishes sitting on the counter next to the sink just to be petty. Better not give the old coot any reason to complain. Now, with a full stomach, Naruto was ready for this mysterious training. During the short walk down to the basement and into the lift, he couldn't help but wonder what it entailed. His grandfather's words from the night before were confusing. What did he mean by learning to finally use his magnet style properly? Was something wrong with the way he'd been using it? His musings were so distracting. He almost didn't notice when the lift shuddered to a stop. He quickly shook his head. Most likely he'd learn what Madara meant momentarily. He just had to be patient. As he stepped into the immense cavern, Naruto was greeted by a recent change. The ceiling had been painted to mimic the sky almost perfectly. It was a suggestion he'd made to his grandfather to brighten the atmosphere. Speaking of his grandfather, he wasn't anywhere in sight. Naruto strained his eyes to try and find him, yet the more he looked, the more confused he got. Where was he? Grandpa, are you here? He shouted into the cave. The noise of his shout reverberated off the walls in a seemingly endless loop. No response. Hesitantly, Naruto decided to try sensing his grandfather. He wasn't very good at it yet. With his eyes closed, Naruto reached out with his chakra. He felt several smaller specks of chakra immediately, most likely rodents. Thankfully, it was only a few seconds later that he picked up his grandfather's signature. It was unmistakable, a massive, overwhelming aura of power, though somehow not oppressive. He always found himself taken aback by the potency of his grandfather's chakra. Oddly enough, it seemed to be coming from one of the walls? What the heck? Confused, Naruto decided to activate his Sharingan to discern what was going on. Instantly, his vision sharpened. By now, he was familiar with seeing everything in crystal clear detail, even better than the sharpest hawk. With it, he was easily able to pick up the gap in the wall that was barely visible. It was hidden in such a way you wouldn't notice it at first. Huh, maybe another room? He said. With his curiosity sated, Naruto was content to wait for his grandfather to appear. It didn't take very long. A few minutes after he'd arrived, the distinct tap, tap, tap of his grandfather's cane reached his ears. Moments later, Madara slipped from behind the opening. A pleasant smile stretched across his grandfather's face when he caught sight of Naruto. There was a long, thin package wrapped in black cloth cradled in his left arm. He couldn't help but wonder what it was, and where his grandfather had been. "Where did you just come from?" he asked curiously when his grandfather made it within earshot. That's leads into a room for working on projects, such as forging. His grandfather answered. "Now, I told you today we would take the first step towards you truly controlling your magnet style. I'm sure you're curious what I meant, correct?" Naruto nodded quickly. He'd spent the rest of the previous night trying to think what his grandfather could have meant. The answer is simple. Until this point, you've just been using random weapons. From the very beginning, I intended to give you something that was left for you, or well, technically your father," Madara said. Naruto rose an eyebrow as roots extended from his grandfather's cane and anchored it to the ground. With his now freed left hand, Madara gripped the cloth of the package cradled in his left arm and pulled on one of the ends. The cloth slowly came unwound. As it fell away, Naruto could see flash of lavender amongst the folds of black cloth. Slowly, a familiar hilt revealed itself, followed by a gleaming bronze guard in the shape of a four-segment window. Soon a snow-white sheath emerged, his grandmother's sword. He'd seen it countless times mounted on the wall above her picture. His eyes snapped up to meet his grandfather's gaze, the confusion written all over his face. "Grandma's sword? Why?" he asked. As far as he knew, it was just a keepsake. Something of his grandmother's his grandfather cherished. "As you know, this sword belonged to your grandmother. It was her favorite weapon, forged by the artisan smiths in the land of iron. On its own, it is a valuable weapon, but there's more to this than meets the eye," Madara said, his voice thick with emotion. Naruto was surprised to see his grandfather's eyes glimmer slightly, as if holding back unshed tears. "Before she died, your grandmother poured the last of her chakra into this blade, including her manifested will. It was meant to help your father when I found him, but now it will help you." His grandfather held the sword out, offering it to him. Hesitantly, Naruto reached out to grasp it. It was surprisingly light. As soon as it touched his hands, he let out a gasp. He felt an instant connection form. Some of his chakra was seemingly drawn into the sword, causing it to flash pink. In that moment, Naruto felt something odd. It wasn't quite words, but more of an impression. Warmth, love, protectiveness, happiness. He knew this feeling. "This feeling, it's that same one I felt when training," he exclaimed. When he looked to his grandfather for an explanation, Madara didn't seem surprised. "Indeed, the part of your grandmother that's in the blade has been calling to you ever since you started practicing with your magnet style," he confirmed. Naruto gripped the sword tightly and cradled it to his chest. This was the last remaining part of his grandmother. A woman he'd never met, yet it was because of her sacrifice his father ever lived to meet his mother. Just like his parents sacrificed themselves for him. This was a tangible link to her, one that he'd cherish. "I'm not exactly sure what the sword can do, except that it will help you achieve even greater feats of magnet style. Though recently I felt the urge to make some modifications. I suspect it was your grandmother's will driving me. I'm sure we'll have some idea before the day is done," his grandfather said. He nodded absent-mindedly. Naruto was still adjusting to the subtle presence he felt from the blade. It wasn't really a consciousness, or even emotions as anyone would understand them. Yet, for some reason a name appeared in his mind. Came from the sword. Senbin Zakura. Its name is Senbin Zakura, he said firmly. As soon as he said the name, the sword gleamed with pink again. It was almost blinding, and he could feel another burst of happiness. He couldn't help the grin that stretched his face. Naruto didn't know it at the time. Receiving that sword was a turning point for him. It would go on to shape the rest of his career as a shinobi, though in the moment nothing so serious was on his mind. He just couldn't wait to test it out. Chapter 12, Graduations and a Stolen Scroll. Sorrowful electric blue eyes gazed at a gravestone. It wasn't anything special, made of a simple smooth, white stone with a name and epithet carved into its face. Perhaps the most significant part was the monochrome Uchiha crest emblazoned at the top of the stone, directly over the neatly carved name. Madara Uchiha, a man who loved his family. A gentle breeze passed by, whipping through the boy's long blonde hair with black roots, which was held up into a high ponytail. Naruto didn't pay the breeze any mind. He rarely got a chance to visit this place. It had been almost a year since his grandfather had passed away. The death hadn't come as a surprise to either of them. Madara had made no attempt to hide his deteriorating health in the past year. Near the very end, he had been bedridden constantly. Despite the long amount of time he had to prepare for the death, it still hurt Naruto. He had taken a week off from the academy to travel to the land of rivers to bury his grandfather alongside his grandmother behind their old house. He'd decided to visit the place on the eve of his graduation. This might be his last chance to visit this place in quite some time. The gentle fragrance of flowers planted by his grandmother long ago filled the air. It was truly a tranquil place, one where his grandfather could finally rest in peace. "Hey grandfather, it's me. I figured I'd come and see you and grandmother one more time before the test," Naruto said to the gravestone. "You'll be glad to hear I haven't slacked off in my training. I think I'm starting to get the hang of that new jutsu, though it still isn't mastered." He looked up at the sky for a moment, watching the clouds drifting lazily overhead. "This'll be the last time I get to come here for a while. Once I pass the test, I'll be a fully fledged shinobi. Soon enough, I think I'll have to tell SASUKE the truth. I just can't help but fear how she'll react. But she'll have to know if I'm going to reveal heritage. I just gotta find the right time. Then I can finally start to restore our clan's honor." He had never forgotten his promise to the raven-haired girl to protect her, even though she never knew of it. While he hadn't been able to tell her who he really was, he had remained her friend. "To be honest, I'm actually a little excited. I've spent so long with limits to my strength, it'll feel good being able to cut loose and have a chance to use some of my actual skills." Naruto snorted. There was no doubt his grandfather would admonish him for thinking like that. He'd whack him over the head with his cane and lecture him about not revealing his secrets until he needed to. Naruto allowed himself a brief melancholy smile. It made him think of all the happy times training with his grandfather. Unfortunately, he wasn't allowed to reminisce for long. "You'd better wrap it up, brat. You have to be back in the Hidden Leaf by midnight tomorrow," the Ninetales growled. Naruto let loose a sigh. He wished he had more time. "I know. Just give me one more minute, Nine." "Why must you call me that boring name?" the fox asked with a growl. "Well, Ninetales gets tedious. Figured I'd mix it up since you don't want a real name. Would you prefer Fuzzy?" he shot back. Naruto had to withhold a smirk. He'd offered to try and come up with a real name for the fox, but it refused. His relationship with the Ninetales had been another thing to change over the past 5 years. At first, the fox had maintained his desire to be left alone, but eventually he started to come around, and they'd reached a somewhat mutual agreement to be partners of a sort. Naruto himself preferred to think they were friends, but he didn't bother bringing it up, since the fox would just deny it and threaten to rip out his eyes for the 1000th time. Shaking himself from his reverie, Naruto looked back at the tombstone. "I promise you, grandfather, I'll restore our family, our clan's pride. I guess I'll see you when I can finally get time to come back. Until then, bye." Closing his eyes and taking a last whiff of the aroma of flowers in the air, Naruto vanished from the garden in back of the simple wooden house. He had to get back home so he could take his final academy test and begin his journey to restore the clan's honor. Beep, 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 beep. Beep, 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 smash. A groggy pair of blue eyes cracked open. Naruto sat up with a groan, as he tried to clear his hazy mind of the last vestiges of sleep. The eggshell white walls of his old apartment greeted his eyes. He'd moved back in here after his grandfather died. It just felt a little weird living in that house alone. He looked to his nightstand and sighed when he saw the smashed alarm clock. Humph. Looks like I need a new one. Again. He shrugged. What's that, the third this month? Ninetales asked mockingly. Naruto ignored his prisoner and/or friend. It really depended on which one you were asking. He stretched his arms over his head with a tired yawn. It took him longer than he had expected to get back to the Leaf. He had only arrived back at 3 o'clock in the morning the night before, leaving him with only 4 hours sleep. Despite this, he felt an overabundance of energy. Today was finally the day. After today, he would finally be a shinobi. Hopping out of bed, Naruto walked across the room to his bathroom to take a shower. It didn't take long. He wasn't one for overly long showers. His closet slid open with an almost inaudible shuffling sound, and Naruto grabbed his clothes from within. First, he pulled on his black shinobi pants, which he bound at the shins with white tape. Then he pulled on a mesh undershirt, over which went his black short-sleeved kimono top, which had a grayish-purple inseam and border. He quickly tied his top closed with a white sash, and then pulled on white arm guards, which covered the front of his forearms up to his elbows. Last but not least, he attached his equipment pouch to the back of his hip. Naruto then stood in front of the mirror and pulled his hair up into what had become his signature high ponytail, with a set of his blonde bangs partially covering his right eye. After he was finished, he just stood in front of the mirror for a moment and took a deep breath. Today will be interesting. I can feel it, he mumbled. Naruto, alongside what remained of his classmates, was waiting for the final part of the graduation exam. They had already completed the written part earlier in the day, and the accuracy and taijutsu portions the day before. Now, though, they had to do the practical part, performing a randomly selected E-rank jutsu for the instructors. So far, most of the class had gone and either passed or failed. Aside from himself, there were less than a handful of students waiting for their turns. Sasuke had been called in just a few minutes before. Despite how confident he was in his skills, Naruto was anxious to get the exam finished. Most people were curious about the results because it would most likely decide the Rookie of the Year. The Rookie of the Year was decided by combining the overall score from their time in the academy and the score on the final exam. Whoever had the highest combined score got the title. Since the competition between him and Sasuke had been so close, it was possible that the Rookie of the Year would depend on the exam alone. But a lot more was at stake than a simple title. Though most people didn't know it, the potential teams would be a lot different depending on the results. If Naruto got Rookie of the Year, then Sasuke would become Kunoichi of the Year, and they would automatically be placed on the same team. But if she became Rookie of the Year, then someone else would be Kunoichi of the Year, and it would be very unlikely they would be on the same team. Naruto wanted to do everything possible so they could be on the same team. He was fairly confident that he would win, but you could never know. What are you going to do if your little girlfriend beats you and you aren't on the same team? Ninetales asked him goadingly. Naruto couldn't help but flush at the fox's taunt. Not because of the fact he was saying he'd lose, but because of his insinuation about Sasuke. It's not like that, Nine. We're just friends, he insisted. To his dismay, all he heard was a snort from the tailed beast. Suddenly, he was taken out of his musing by the sound of the door sliding open. A second later, Sasuke stepped out of the classroom and into the hall. Naruto's eyes automatically flickered to her forehead, where he wasn't surprised to see a brand new blue-clothed headband. His then met her gaze and offered her a slight smirk. Well, I guess you didn't have any trouble then, he said. Sasuke scoffed at his words. Please, what did you expect? I think even an idiot like you could pass that test. She replied with a smirk of her own. As he often did, Naruto found himself bemused at the changes his friend had gone through. If you told him the tomboy he first met would start to turn into an actual girl, he wouldn't have believed you. She'd changed a lot since they were younger. Gone was the tomboyish clothes of her youth. Now she let her long, blue-tinted ebony tresses flow free like her mother, and she favored a feminine Uchiha high-collared zip-up tank top that was partially unzipped, and a white apron skirt with black shorts underneath. Undoubtedly, in a few years, she'd be the spitting image of Mikoto, although her looks weren't the only thing that had changed. She wasn't as bad as she was in the first year after her family's death, but she was still rather cold to pretty much anyone but him. Even then, for most people that didn't know her as well as he did, they would think she was rather scathing towards him. TCH, please. Just because you had the top spot most of the month, don't be getting cocky. I've still had it more than you. He shot back. Before they could get too into their back and forth, Irika's voice called out from inside the classroom. Next up, Naruto. Naruto gave Sasuke one last smirk, and then made his way into the room. Without all the kids in its tiered seats, the classroom looked even larger than normal. Irika looked much the same as he had since he became their instructor their second year, with his brown hair in a spiky pineapple ponytail, his deep tan skin, and the large scar across the bridge of his nose. Naruto had always liked Irika, since he was actually nice to him and didn't seem to hate him for being the Jinchuriki of the Ninetales. Next to him sat another man, one of a paler complexion. The pale-skinned man stood out most with his silver hair, odd for someone his age. Other than that, he didn't have any distinguishing marks. The man's name was Mizuki. He had joined the teaching staff as Irika's assistant 2 years ago, and Naruto found out almost immediately that, unlike Irika, Mizuki clearly hated him and was one of those that thought he was the Ninetales. Tisich, as if a puny human like you could be as majestic and powerful as myself. Ninetales scoffed. Naruto barely resisted rolling his eyes at the fox's vanity. Irika smiled at Naruto kindly. All right, Naruto, you have to successfully use the clone jutsu to pass. Naruto nodded confidently. Of course, he said. Years ago, he might have been worried about the clone jutsu, but he had gained an amazing amount of control over the years, especially for a Jinchuriki. Of course, he didn't gain it solely through training, but that was a story for another time. Unlike that time almost 7 years ago, he stepped confidently into the center of the room and quickly performed the seals. Clone jutsu. Instantly, a massive amount of puff sounds filled the air. Just as Naruto had promised, the room was filled with illusionary clones, crammed closer together than canned sardines. They even covered the walls and ceiling. Naruto took more than a little pleasure in the surprised look on Irika's face, and the downright shocked look Mizuki was sporting. His jaw was literally hanging open. Sure, he could have secretly used shadow clones, but what was the fun in that? When Irika recovered from his surprise, he clapped proudly at the performance. Very well done, Naruto. I think that's the most clones I've ever seen, and they all look extremely real. Needless to say, you graduate. Now come up and choose your forehead protector. Naruto acknowledged his sensei with a nod and walked up to the table, where they had laid out headbands of varying styles and colors. A simple, black-clothed forehead protector caught his eye immediately. He reached down and picked it up off the table and tied it loosely around his neck. Well, congratulations on graduating, Naruto, Irika said, though he smiled even wider at him and continued. Also, although I'll need to tally the score to be sure, I'm pretty sure you've earned Rookie of the Year with this performance. That drew a rare beaming smile to Naruto's face. Thanks, Sensei. I guess I'll see you in a couple days for the orientation. With that, Naruto strode out of the room. On his way out, he caught something odd out of the corner of his eye. It almost looked as if Mizuki was staring at him with malice. But when he looked again, he was simply looking at him with that same thinly veiled disgust as usual. That's really odd. 9, was that just me? Naruto had learned that the Ninetales could sense negative feelings. If he were to gain enough control, he would gain the power as well, but for now he had to depend on it. No, it was fleeting, but that man definitely has some bad intentions. I can't tell whether he has something planned or not, so I'd advise being careful. Ninetales replied. Naruto nodded absent-mindedly. As he exited the room, he immediately noticed that Sasuke was there waiting for him across the hall. She had her arms crossed and was giving him her signature scowl, though he could tell there wasn't any heat behind it. So, I suppose you got Rookie of the Year? She stated bluntly. Naruto rose an eyebrow at how calm she seemed over it. Yeah, I did. You don't sound surprised. Although he said it as a statement, Sasuke obviously took it as the question it was. As they started to walk outside together, she answered his unasked question. He didn't exactly say it, but Irika hinted pretty strongly that unless you failed that part 1 would be Kunoichi of the year. She said with a nonchalant shrug. To Naruto's surprise, she gave him a rare smile. You shouldn't be so surprised. After all, it's based on overall grades, and I never did as good as you in teamwork and assertiveness. I can't help it if I don't like people. Naruto snorted in laughter at that. Sasuke wasn't shy about the fact she didn't like most of the people in their class. Whether it be her male fans or the females who looked up to her, she found them annoying. So, you want to go eat somewhere to celebrate? He asked hopefully. To his disappointment, Sasuke merely shook her head. No thanks, I'm gonna go try out a new jutsu. I want to get it down before our orientation. Although Naruto was disappointed, he wasn't surprised. It wasn't uncommon for Sasuke to prefer training to hanging out. Not that he was much better, and more often than not they trained together. Though each liked to keep their own little aces to surprise the other with. Oh well, I guess I'll see you then. I've got a jutsu I'm working on too, replied Naruto. For just an instant their eyes met, and he saw the light of competition dancing in her eyes. I bet I get done first. How many times do you think you'll blow yourself up this time? She asked mockingly. Naruto felt his cheeks heat up at her reminder of some of his more destructive attempts at creating jutsu. In response, he fired up and said, yeah, well, I don't see you making any jutsu from scratch. You just have to read a scroll and do what it says. No imagination. Unfortunately, his comment didn't have the effect he was hoping for. TCH, better unimaginative than missing all my hair. How long did it take to regrow again? Naruto growled and felt his face heat up even more. Hey, that was one time, he protested. Whatever, I'll see you later, she replied with a vacant wave. Naruto sighed and waved back. Yeah, I'll see you in a couple days. As he left the dirt courtyard, Naruto felt a shiver down the back of his neck. It was that odd feeling you got of someone watching you. A subtle glance around him didn't reveal anything obvious. There were numerous families greeting their children. An excited chatter filled the air with a confused jumble of voices. Occasionally, he noticed some of the parents shoot him a dirty look. Oi, Fox, sense anything weird? He asked. No response. The lazy furball was probably napping. Just to be safe, he decided to try sensing for anything off. Naruto closed his eyes and took a deep, calming breath. A light pulse of chakra rippled outwards. It extended tens of meters around him. In his mind, he could see multiple bright blue flames of chakra. He couldn't sense any signatures in a position that might be suspicious, or the presence of any techniques that could be used to spy. Ultimately, he decided to write it off. Must have been my imagination. He had better things to be doing than jumping at shadows, like trying to finish that jutsu. Crum! A beam of blue-white lightning smashed into a massive brown boulder. Particles of rock blasted into the air. When the dust cleared, a black scorch mark marred the surface of the boulder. Naruto frowned in annoyance. His right was extended in front of him, smoke wisping off it. The smell of ozone was heavy around him. He still felt a slight tingle from the lightning chakra. Still got a long way to go to finish this one. He mused. There wasn't enough power in the jutsu. It should have been able to pierce straight through the boulder. He'd based it off the lightning-style false darkness jutsu, but it still lacked the piercing force. The beam was too dispersed, not to mention he wasn't anywhere close to performing it without seals. Seals were one of the main drawbacks for him. Since he used Senbonzakura, he needed to be able to use almost any jutsu with one-handed seals at the most. He tried numerous different combinations of hand seals to achieve the result, but none of them seemed to work. Maybe the problem wasn't with the hand seals? Behind him, he could hear the sound of several other blasts of lightning from his clones. Hopefully one of them would have success because he was at a loss for what to do. It was beyond frustrating to have to try and figure these things out on his own. Even before his death, his grandfather hadn't been helping him much in his training for about a year and a half. With it being so obvious his grandfather wasn't long for the world, Naruto had insisted that they focus on enjoying the time they had left before his grandfather couldn't do anything with him. Brat, I'm feeling something interesting. It's that dumbass instructor of yours. Ninetales said, Huh, might be nice to take my mind of this training stuff. Eager for a distraction from his problem, Naruto quickly latched onto what the Ninetales said. Though technically it could have meant either of his instructors, Naruto assumed it meant Mizuki. Neither of them were particularly fond of the man. Oh, define interesting, he said with a raised eyebrow. I can feel the fool traveling near here rapidly. He's always chocked full of negative emotions, but greed and vindictiveness seem particularly present. More interesting is that pineapple-haired fool is chasing after him, and all he's feeling is concern. Ninetales explained. Naruto's eyebrows shot up. That did sound interesting. Curiosity piqued. He closed his eyes and focused his sensing. This time he felt quite a bit more strain as he pushed them to the limit. His range extended far beyond what he'd done earlier. In his mind's eye he could see thousands of chakra signatures for almost a mile around him. Most of them were minuscule, barely pinpricks of light. Those presences were probably animals of some kind. Because of how remote his grandfather's house was within the village, the two signatures large enough to be shinobi stood out like a sore thumb. It didn't take long to lock onto the two Kurama mentioned. Each signature had a different feel to it, and he was very familiar with the feeling of his instructor's signatures. Just as the foxes said, he could feel the somewhat rabid signature he'd come to associate with Mizuki moving to the edge of the village rapidly. Oddly enough, from the fluctuations it was giving off, Naruto could swear he was using a transformation jutsu. Weird. Closed behind Mizuki, Naruto could feel Irika. His signature gave off warm and sharp feel. Just from the speed at which he was moving, he could tell Irika was chasing Mizuki. The question was why. He could feel the itch to investigate it. The fact he never trusted Mizuki and this reeked of suspicion may have swayed things in the favor of investigating. A quick glance at his clones showed them practicing the jutsu on some cliffs in the distance made of orange-brown rocks. Occasionally one would let loose a blast of lightning and a shower of dust would erupt. Yes, they had that covered. Naruto smirked. An excited tingle started to build in his stomach and spread to the rest of his body. There was no time like the present to go investigate. Luckily, the two Chunin were going at a speed he could easily catch up to or even get in front of. His leg muscles tensed as he flooded them with chakra. Well, let's go see what they're up to, he muttered to himself. He vanished in a blur of speed. A whisper of wind is all he left in his wake. Silvery beams of moonlight filtered through the treetops, bathing Naruto in their ethereal light. The trees themselves were reduced to a series of green streaks of varying shade in his peripheral vision. With their massive limbs, it was easy for him to leap through the trees to move faster. Using his sensing abilities, he could tell his targets were only a little bit in front of him. Felt like Mizuki was slowing down. Seconds later, the man seemed to come to a complete stop, soon followed by Irika. It was the place that Mizuki stopped that caught his attention. He knew this forest like the back of his hand. The only thing there was a decrepit old shack, a remnant from several outposts the village had created prior to building the barrier wall. It was the first method they'd used to prepare for incoming enemies. What could Mizuki possibly want there? I suppose there's only one way to find out. Let's speed things up. Naruto held up a half-ram seal with his index, middle finger, and thumb pointed upwards and his ring and pinky curled to his palm. With a slight application of chakra, performed a teleportation to bridge the distance and get to the clearing. The forest disappeared in a blur of colors. A distance that should have taken him a quarter minute to reach bled away in less than 2 seconds. He reappeared in the shadows of a massive tree trunk. Immediately, his gaze landed on the clearing below. It took several seconds for it to register. Directly across the clearing and below, there was a beat-up shack. Its walls were worn from years of weather damage, and the single window was covered in a layer of black grime with a prominent crack in one of the panes. Two people stood facing off. A tense atmosphere was in the air, barely restrained tension waiting for a chance to burst. The first, with his back to Naruto, was Irika-sensei. His brown ponytail was distinctive even at this distance. He was vaguely aware of Irika saying something to the second person, mostly because the sight of him made his blood boil. His eyes became a glacial blue at the sight of himself with a scroll on his back horizontally that was as long as he was tall. He recognized it from time spent with Gramps. The Scroll of Seals. It was a scroll created by his grandfather's friend Hashirama, the first Hokage. Written on it was every forbidden or powerful technique that belonged to the hidden leaf. What in the... Oh ho ho! This is hilarious. Aren't you glad we investigated, boy? Ha 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 ha. The Nine-Tails gloated. His booming laughter made Naruto grit his teeth to stop himself from snapping back. He shook his head. Now wasn't the time for distractions. He needed as much information as possible before acting. Belatedly, he started to listen to Irika shouting at Mizuki, who was disguised as himself. "Would you possibly hope to accomplish stealing it? Are you really going to throw everything away?" Irika asked. The copy of him had a sick grin on his face, full of arrogance and greed. It was a sight that made him shiver in disgust. What do I hope to accomplish? Revenge for how this stupid place treated me. His doppelganger answered. Though he couldn't see his face, he could tell from the quiver in Irika's voice when he responded he was totally shocked. Our revenge? Why? You've never let how people treated you get to you before, and you've worked so hard to be the best. You wanted to be Hokage, didn't you? That was all just an act. I was biding my time to get my hands on this. I even got close to the Hokage, also I could get this scroll and regain my power. Mizuki replied. The manic glint Naruto saw in his own blue eyes was disturbing. Despite how disturbed he was also starting to get a grasp on what Mizuki was going for. He was setting the table to frame Naruto for stealing the Scroll of Seals. The fact it was Irika, a teacher who liked Naruto, that was trying to stop him would help sell the act. Nobody would question it if Irika himself was convinced. Of course, there were a few flaws, but Mizuki would have needed to know things about Naruto he couldn't possibly know to have avoided them. All in all, it was a decent plan. Regain your power? I'm not sure what you mean, Irika said nervously. Tsage, don't play dumb. I know the truth, Irika-sensei, Mizuki growled. Naruto's eyebrows actually shot up at what he suspected was coming. So he was going to go all in and break the law about revealing his status, just to make it look like Naruto found out he was a Jinchuriki and snapped. I know I'm the nine-tailed fox that attacked the village, his doppelganger shouted. The reverberation of it bounced of the wall of tree trunks in the clearing and made it sound all the more deafening. Or he's an idiot who just wants to get back at me by making me the scapegoat because he thinks I'm the fox. How cliché, he thought dully. His grip on Senbonzakura tightened. The cloth felt good in his hand. At this point, he had all the information he really needed. It was about time to end this farce. The only problem was, how did he take Mizuki down without harming the scroll? Since you want to get in my way, I guess I'll just have to kill you, Irika-sensei, Mizuki said. Naruto's eyes widened. He'd been so busy thinking about how to take Mizuki down he missed it when Mizuki suddenly grabbed a handful of kunai from his thigh. In a flash, the traitor threw the kunai at Irika faster than he thought him capable of. The black knives glinted dangerously as they whizzed through the air. Despite the surprise, Naruto wasn't overly worried at first. Irika was skilled enough to dodge a few kunai. That quickly changed. Mizuki began to perform a set of hand seals Naruto recognized in an instant. No way. Does he really know the Shuriken Shadow Clone Jutsu? Mizuki shouted. In an instant, the 50 more kunai flashed into existence around the first three. They were flying at Irika like a metallic black rain of death. The collective noise as they whizzed through the air sounded like a swarm of bees. No way could Irika dodge that many kunai, and he didn't feel like chancing whether Irika could do a substitution without seals. Without a second thought, he performed a seal-less replacement, switching with a rock on the ground behind Irika. He felt the familiar odd sensation of being squeezed through a narrow tube briefly. 1 second he was on the branch, and the next he felt springy moss underfoot and his sensei's back mere feet in front of him. The wave of deadly throwing knives was almost on them. Irika was so distracted he didn't even notice Naruto. With less than a second to act, he blazed through a series of 4 hand seals, ending on dog. In near the same instant, he slammed his palms into the ground. The ground shivered. With the deep, harsh groan of stone grinding together, A large stone wall erupted from the ground. A cloud of dust and upturned earth surrounded the base. Clang, shing, clink. No sooner had the wall been erected when the screech of metal on stone rang out. It continued for several seconds. Naruto withheld a wince at the shrill sound. He pushed through it though. Now that he was on the ground, it was the perfect chance to catch Mizuki off guard. With the noise of the kunai as cover, he created 2 shadow clones with orders to skirt the edge of the clearing to flank Mizuki. Before he could even think of taking the man down, he had to get the scroll of seals out of the way. As the last kunai bounced off the wall, the clearing fell deathly silent. Better keep my eyes on him, he thought, channeling more chakra into the ground. He forced the wall to recede back to where it came from with that same harsh groan. Just as soon as it appeared, the wall was gone. The only sign it was there a wide, thick scar of upturned earth in the mossy forest floor. What the hell? How did you do that, Irika? Mizuki stuttered in shock. I didn't, Irika said. His voice was thick with so much confusion it made Naruto silently snort. His lips twitched into a playful smirk at the shock of the 2 Chunin. He had to give his clones time to flank Mizuki. Might as well have some fun. I heard imitation is the sincerest form of flattery, but I think I'll pass, he said loudly. His words garnered an instant reaction. Irika spun around, his eyes stretched wide. Naruto, but how? He said. His eyes darted back to the still transformed Mizuki, who'd gone pale, and back to Naruto. Funny story that, Naruto said as he took a few slow steps forward. His sensei tensed as he approached. There I was, minding my own business trying to get down a new jutsu, when somehow I sensed 2 Chunin speeding through the forest to the edge of the village. Naturally, I decided to see what the fuss was, he said with fake casualness. By that point, he was standing right beside Irika. 2 Chunin, Irika exclaimed. While he answered Irika, Naruto's eyes never left Mizuki. His sharp gaze pinned him in place. Yep. Consider me curious. Aren't you a little old to cosplay as a teenager, Mizuki? Mizuki, Irika exclaimed. His eyes darted to Naruto's doppelganger, who'd recovered from his surprise and looked at them with a sneer. Tage. Guess the ruse is up, Mizuki growled. A plume of smoke erupted around the doppelganger with a poof. The wisps of smoke curled away, revealing his other instructor, or former instructor as the case might be. A pair of Fuma shuriken, giant shuriken named after the clan that made them famous, hung from his back. Combined with the black bandana-style headband, it gave him a much more intimidating appearance. Mizuki pinned Naruto with a fierce glare. So you managed to figure me out, Ninetails, he spat. Naruto heard a sharp gasp from beside him. He could practically feel the tension radiating off his sensei. His own reaction was more subdued. Just to piss Mizuki off, he gave the man the most unenthusiastic look he could. Was that supposed to make me all emotional and confused? Sorry to tell you, I already know I'm a Jinchuriki. Now, why don't you give up before I have to hurt you? He said. If looks could kill, Naruto would have died 10 times over from the one Mizuki gave him. The traitorous Chunin's eyes bulged and he clenched his fists so hard that the knuckles turned white. He let out an insane laugh. Ha! You hurt me? Don't act so high and mighty with me, you filthy demon. Without any warning, he whipped his arm forward and released one of his giant shuriken at them. The giant metal throwing star hurtled through the air with a faint whistle. Look out, Naruto, we have to move, Irika hissed. Naruto smirked with amusement. Nah, I got this, he said. Before Irika could give any more protest, Naruto dashed forward several meters and stood in the path of the Fuma shuriken. Even though he didn't have his Sharingan active, his training allowed him to follow the shuriken easily. Naruto remembered his grandfather's training and began to control his breathing. He gripped his sword's hilt tightly as the metal star approached them. Watch the trajectory. Release the blade in one smooth motion at the last second possible. Although it was only seconds, to Naruto it may as well have been an eternity for the shuriken to reach him. At the last instant, he whipped out Senbonzakura and aimed it for the shuriken. At the same time, he channeled wind chakra into his sword. It met the star with a light ring and a shower of sparks. The sword cleaved through the hard-forged metal as if it was butter. The two halves veered to either side and impacted the ground with a soft thunk. Naruto took great satisfaction in the stunned looks on both the adults' faces. He sent a smug grin at Mizuki. "You should really give up. I'll give you one more chance. Then I'm going to show you what my sword can really do," he said. His words fell on deaf ears. Mizuki whipped his other arm forward and threw the second shuriken. This time, Naruto didn't even bother to cut the shuriken in two. He simply batted it to the side with his sword. It caused his sword to vibrate in his hand, but it wasn't anything he couldn't handle. Naruto looked Mizuki coldly. "Guess that's a no," said Naruto. He had to hide a smirk, as he noticed his clones hiding in the shadows behind Mizuki. With a subtle nod, he gave them the go-ahead. Mizuki opened his mouth to make a snide retort, but instead he let loose a startled gasp as a bruising kick slammed into his back from the clone on his right. In the same instant, the one on the left used his sword to cut the strap holding the scroll of seals. He scooped it up in his arms and dashed back into the forest. The silver-haired mane was sent tumbling across the ground and into a tree with a dull thump. All the wind was knocked from his lungs in a harsh whoosh, and he was left gasping to try to regain it. He struggled weakly, clawing and scratching his way to stand weakly on his feet, his back supported by the tree behind him. "I'm growing tired of this, so I'll end it quickly." Naruto held his sword in front of his face. The tip pointed to the sky, and the flat of the blade faced towards him. A haze of visible chakra began to whip about his person, kicking up dust around his feet. The blade glowed with an ethereal pink light and seemed to scatter to the wind like flower petals. When all was said and done, Naruto was left with only his katana's hilt. For all intents and purpose, it appeared as if the blade had disappeared. Naruto knew better. He could feel fragments of the blade, composed of millions of particles of steel alloy sand saturated in his blood and chakra. He willed them to attack his opponent. Both Irika and Mizuki blinked in shock. Mizuki, who had looked fearful at the aura that had built up around Naruto, began to laugh derisively. "What was that it?" Mizuki asked derisively. "Your big bad finish is to make some pretty dust? How pathetic can you—" "Gurk." The delusional man's words were cut short. Instantaneously, there was blood everywhere. In a disturbingly beautiful display, pink petals danced around Mizuki. Numerous cuts tore open all across his body, sending his crimson blood spurting into the air. Mizuki slumped to the ground in a heap, gasping from the pain of his wounds. Naruto stayed alert for several seconds. When it became clear Mizuki was defeated, he let out a sigh of relief. He was glad that was finally over with. He reformed the blade of Senbonzakura and sheathed it once more with a soft shink. For a moment he stood in silence, enjoying the night air. In the aftermath, he could still feel adrenaline pumping through him. It heightened his senses and filled him with a restless energy. "Gotta slow it down." Naruto closed his eyes for a few seconds. Naruto, is everything okay?" Irika asked awkwardly. From the sound of it, he had moved to stand behind him. Naruto opened his eyes and turned to give his teacher a smile. "Yeah, everything's fine. Just got a bit too hyped up there. I'm good now," he said. Glancing to the side, he met the eyes of one of his clones. He took a moment to dig through his pouch and get a roll of ninja wire. The metal felt cool against his fingers. He tossed the roll to the clone and said, "Tend to his wounds, then tie him up and then transport him to torture and interrogation. I've got a feeling he'll have a lot to say," he ordered. The clone nodded sharply and began to carry out his orders. It moved over and quickly began to bind Mizuki so that he couldn't escape. With that taken care of, Naruto turned his attention back to Irika. The man seemed to have recovered from his discomfort. "You're a lot stronger than you let on, Naruto. That was really impressive how efficiently you handled Mizuki," he said, a wide smile on his face. Naruto flushed slightly at the compliment and rubbed the back of his head awkwardly. Thanks," he said with an awkward chuckle. A glance at the sky showed him just how late it was getting. It was about time to wrap all this up. "Well, I guess I better go report this to Gramps. He'll definitely want to know about this," You could probably go home. Only one of them really needed to report to the Hokage immediately. It made sense for him to do it considering, given their relationship, it was a foregone conclusion that Naruto was going to talk to the Hokage anyways. Irika nodded his agreement. Thanks. I think I'll turn in my report in the morning. See you later, Naruto. He replied. With a slight whisper of displaced air, Irika disappeared. A spiral of tree leaves was left in his wake to slowly spiral to the ground. For several moments he just stood still. There was no real reason to rush off. Finally, he sighed. Better get going. He was about to leave himself, but the voice of his clone stopped him cold. Boss, you might want to take a look at this. Naruto's gaze snapped to the side to see his clone standing over Mizuki, a seal tag in one hand and a torn-up piece of black cloth in the other. Judging from the clone's tone, he wasn't going to like the implications of the items. Okay, I'll bite. Let me see them. The cloth first, he demanded. Wordlessly, the clone stepped forward and handed him item. Naruto frowned as he felt the cloth deposited into his right hand. It was sturdy, but not rough, with a certain softness to it. He could also tell it was a very breathable fabric. Almost like, he froze, and hurriedly grabbed the cloth with his left hand and flipped it over while stretching it out. A gasp tore from his lips. As the cloth unfolded, it became clear it was a shirt. Not just any shirt. The light purple inseam stood out starkly in the silver light. This was his shirt. He even recognized the slashes in the fabric. It was from a spar with SASUKE in class last month. Given it was basically ruined, he'd decided to just toss the thing out. After all, he had many more of them. Why in the world would Mizuki have this? He muttered. I think the seal tag pretty much answers that. The clone said. His gaze snapped to the tag in the clone's hand. Without even waiting to have it handed to him, he snatched it from his hand. In that moment, he was hyper-aware of the smooth feeling of the paper. Chakra flooded his eyes, and his perception shifted. With perfect clarity, he started to decipher the symbols on the tag. He was no expert, nowhere near as good as his parents, but he could understand the purpose of it well enough. His eyes widened. This tag copies someone else's chakra signature. With this, Mizuki could have fooled the barrier into thinking it was me. He exclaimed. A ringing buzz filled his ears. He felt slightly detached as the full implications of the items hit him. If he hadn't sensed Mizuki and decided to investigate, the man would have possibly been able to successfully frame him. Sure, Gramps wouldn't have bought it, but with such overwhelming evidence, even his absolute authority might not have been enough. It would certainly have provided enough distraction for Mizuki to make a clean getaway. That wasn't what had him so frazzled, though. There's no chance Mizuki could make this on his own. Someone gave this to him. He had help in this. He concluded. Next to him, the clone nodded grimly. His gaze snapped over to it. I'll take this directly to Gramps. Get Mizuki to TNI. Immediately. Will do, boss, said. Without another word, the clone hoisted the bound form of Mizuki onto its shoulder. A second later, it vanished into thin air. Unlike when Irika left, no sign of its departure remained. In the aftermath, Naruto took the time to steady his breathing. That discovery had been quite the shock. Now alone, Naruto took a moment to stare up at the moon. It wouldn't hurt anything to take a moment to unwind before he went to see Gramps. Once again, the cool evening air helped to center him. The day had been rather eventful, and he was eager to be done with it. Tomorrow he would need to go and complete his ninja registration, but for now he just wanted to get home and go to sleep. A full night's rest and he'd be good as new. Maybe this isn't the best time to mention this, but I'm pretty sure the scroll is a fake, his other clone said, stepping out of the forest awkwardly with the massive scroll in his hands. Naruto let out an exasperated snort. He felt like throwing his hands up in defeat. Of course it is. Let's just get going before anything else unexpected happens. With one last glance around the moonlit clearing, Naruto vanished in flicker of speed.
Hey, you! Yes, you! If you are here and want more seasons, don't forget to give your comment asking for the next seasons, and don't forget to give your like and subscribe for more. So, bye bye.